Hey Sheepdogs, welcome to the Sheepdog Project. Probably going to be a short one today, and Doc is running solo. Tim is still on the road, so just me today. Since it is just me, I decided to do a topic that is somewhat doctorly, and I had a couple of different options to go with. Ultimately, what I decided to talk about today is the fight or flight response, and this specifically comes from a suggestion on Twitter. Got me to thinking. We had talked previously about doing some stuff kind of along the lines of this topic, but I think I'm going to go ahead and dive in, do it in depth. I'll try to keep it as interesting as possible. I'm not going to get too geeky. This is not science class, but I do want it to be informative, and I hope everybody gets something out of it. So, diving right in. Fight or flight. What is the fight or flight response? So we hear that kicked around a lot, right? We've all probably heard it in school. We've heard it mentioned in media, in movies. What is it? Quite basically, and to break it down in simplest terms, the fight or flight response is what has kept us alive as a species. When we talk about the three groups, and we talk about it all the time, as you know on this show, we talk about the sheep, we talk about the wolves, we talk about the sheepdogs. Well, typically one of the characteristics that we ascribe to the sheep is that they don't have that fight or flight response, that they are completely oblivious to the threat, completely oblivious to their surroundings. So they don't know what to do when they're faced with a threat. Whereas the sheepdogs have that fight or flight response. So whether, depending on which route you go, it doesn't matter. You have that response. If you're listening to this, I guarantee you have it. It was passed down to you genetically. Now, some of that can go awry over generations and being passed down, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. So let's talk about what it is. At its core, this is what helps us to perceive threats. It's not 100% though. It's not always right. Sometimes you might perceive something as a threat, or the part of your brain, I should say, perceives something as a threat, and it might not necessarily be a threat. A lot of it has to do with memory experience that you've gained throughout your life. If you've ever heard a sound or seen a particular thing or smelled something and it's triggered a little something into you, you feel your heart rate increase, right? And we could do a whole show talking about that, because then we're talking about post-traumatic stress and everything else. These are all from learned experiences. This is pattern recognition that helps your body decide, and that helps what we call your limbic system decide when there is a perceived threat, something that can harm you. The fight or flight response is all about reacting to that. It's about gearing you up and ensuring your survival, either by fighting for your survival or by running away and getting away from that threat. So how does it work? When we're breaking down how it works, we have to get a little bit sciencey here. We have to talk about the autonomic nervous system. So when you think about the autonomic nervous system, just think about everything that your body is doing that you don't necessarily have to think about, that it's going to do it on its own. Temperature regulation, your food passing through your body. Obviously, you're not consciously having to think about breathing, although that's something you can do, and we're going to talk about that as well. But you don't have to consciously think about it. You don't have to consciously think about keeping your heart beating. You don't have to consciously think about, I'm going to move this muscle or that muscle, although you can. The autonomic nervous system is what is regulating everything that's going on without your thinking about it. And roughly it breaks down into two categories. You have the parasympathetic system, which is a lot of your day-to-day stuff. We call it the rest and digest aspect of the autonomic system. We're not going to talk about that today, so just push it off to the side. Don't even worry about the parasympathetic system. What we're talking about is fight or flight, and that is the sympathetic nervous system. So that's what we're talking about. So where does this all start? Where does this all begin? Remember that perceived threat that I talked about? Somewhere in your environment, something that you can detect using your senses, your primitive brain interprets as a threat. And where that occurs is in your amygdala. Your amygdala is in the more primitive portion of your brain. It doesn't require any higher reasoning. And that's why it's remained largely unchanged for millennia. The amygdala is a portion of your brain that is actually more or less completely mature at birth. So even though a baby doesn't know how to interpret what's going on, what the information is, all that regulation is occurring, and it can, for example, you see startle reflexes in babies. You can pretend like you're going to drop them, and they have a little reaction to that. That's because their primitive portion of their brain already knows how to react to that. It knows how to perceive things that are a danger, even if it can't put it into verbalization exactly what that danger might be. In this primitive portion of your brain, the amygdala has the advantage in that it bypasses portions of your higher brain. It bypasses the reasoning centers of your brain. This is why when you hear a gunshot, or maybe it's a car backfire, because again, remember, we're talking about a perceived threat, not necessarily a real threat, or anything happens just in that blink of an eye. A lot of times you hear people talk about how they reacted. They sought cover, or they assumed a fighting stance, or they drew their weapon before they even realized what was going on, because the amygdala has a shortcut. It can basically send out all these signals in such a rapid fashion that it's already occurring much, much faster than the reasoning centers of your brain, than the prefrontal cortex and the higher portions of your brain can process it. So you can't put words to it yet. You can't quite describe it yet. Your higher brain hasn't really analyzed it yet, but your lizard brain, the more primitive part of your brain, has already kicked your body into action. And that's the way it has to be, because if you had to have a debate at a cognitive level every time there may or may not be a threat, basically your survival instincts would operate like branches of the government. And we know how long it takes for them to get anything done. That's not what you want. You don't want a committee meeting to decide if a saber-toothed tiger is going to rip out your entrails or not. You need to have immediate reaction. And that's the advantage of the amygdala having that shortcut to communicate those signals. What happens, again, I'm not going to break it down at an overly scientific level, but suffice it to say that what happens through these impulses is a hormone cascade. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol all ramped up in your body. Epinephrine is adrenaline, is the other word for it. We all know of epinephrine as being the EpiPens that people use for bee stings and allergic reactions, but it's adrenaline. It's the same thing. So the adrenal cortex, or the adrenal medulla rather, gets stimulated, and boom, you have a rush of adrenaline. This hormone cascade is very important for what comes immediately after, for the physiologic and physical reactions to that perceived threat. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. First and foremost, the one we always think about, your heart rate increases, right? We all know that epinephrine, adrenaline, causes your heart rate to increase. That's one of the big side effects when we give somebody a shot of epinephrine for an allergic reaction. We expect their heart rate to go way, way, way up. And that's why in some cases people have been afraid to give it, especially in the elderly, people that might have some existing coronary artery disease, because you're going to cause that tachycardia is what we call it. You're going to cause that racing heart. But that's important. You want more blood flowing, because remember, you're in this fight or flight state. So your heart rate goes up. You've all felt this before. Might have been something as simple as getting up in front of a group to give a speech, or knocking on that young lady's front door when you were in high school and knowing that you're going to meet her dad. It doesn't necessarily have to be a threat to life and limb. It can be whatever you perceive as a threat. Go back to the time that when we were living in a tribal fashion, we weren't worried about social awkwardness. We weren't worried about getting up and giving a speech. So that's not what these reflexes were designed for. But translating into modern day, we have a whole new ball of wax in different things that we might feel anxiety about, might feel a perceived threat about. So these reactions tend to cross over. And you might feel this very physical fight or flight reaction from something that's strictly social or strictly emotional. That's not at all uncommon. The next thing that happens, of course, heart rate increases, so your respiratory rate increases, right? If we're going to pump more blood, we need to have more oxygen flowing as well. This is something I'm going to talk about really, really in depth a little bit later on, about that respiratory rate increase, why it's important, what you can do to specifically address that. So I'm not going to get into that too much right at this point, but just to suffice it to say that both heart rate and respiratory rate are increasing as part of this parasympathetic reaction. Another thing that happens that people don't typically take note of is your gastrointestinal system, especially the upper gastrointestinal system, slows down virtually to a stop. Why is this important? A lot of times you get that feeling of nausea that either accompanies that fight or flight reaction or occurs immediately thereafter. There's a lot of chemical precursors that play into that nausea, but another big thing that happens is if you have a full stomach, let's say you were sitting down at an outdoor cafe somewhere in Paris having a big meal and somebody pulled out a semi-automatic weapon and started firing into that cafe and you've got a full stomach. Well, that's not going anywhere. That's sitting right where it is. That could mean that at some point, and we've all seen this, people that get so nervous they throw up. That nausea reaction is primarily a chemical reaction to everything that's flowing through their body, but they also have a full stomach on top of everything else, so it's coming right back up. Another thing that happens, your peripheral blood vessels constrict. So your superficial vessels, the vessels on your skin. So a lot of times people talk about feeling maybe cold and clammy all over as part of this adrenaline surge. That's because all of the vessels of your skin typically are constricting. A lot of times, when people have a big fright, they say you're as white as a ghost, something scared you. And that's a big reason for it. Although some people flush, and that's a little bit different, typically these peripheral vessels are constricting down. This has two great survival benefits. Number one, less blood flow is going to the skin, because right now your body's not really worried about that. It's worried about some other stuff, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But another great kind of byproduct of that is you get this clamping down. So let's say you do take some type of superficial flesh injury. You're going to have less bleeding from that injury because you're clamped down all over. So there's really two benefits to that. So if the peripheral blood vessels are clamping down, what are your central vessels doing now? Well, they're dilating. So vessels that are carrying blood to your major muscle groups or to your vital organs, they're wide open. Those highways are wide open. Those red blood cells have to get to those major muscle groups and to those vital organs because you need everything functioning at 100% at this particular moment because you're in a life and death situation. So all those vessels are as big as they can possibly get, taking those oxygenated red blood cells to those major muscles that are going to either move you into the fight and engagement or speed you away from danger. And also to your heart, to your liver, which is important, and I'm talking about that in a second, to your brain, of course, to all the lungs, to all the major organs. Another kind of a neat thing that happens is your tears and your saliva stop excreting. Okay, that's something that's not really important right now. So people find themselves blinking a lot, especially after an event like that. People notice that their mouth was very dry. I got up there and I was so nervous. My mouth felt like sandpaper. Everything's drying up, right? Your body's not worried about any type of excretion right now. That has a little bit more to do with the rest and digest that I talked about previously. Don't worry about it. Just throw it off to the side. Just suffice it to say that your mouth's drying up and your eyes are drying up. Speaking of your eyes, your pupils dilate. Your pupils are going to get really big. They're going to let a lot more light in. That's going to mean some things very specifically as it pertains to the quality of your vision, specifically to the depth of your vision and to your peripheral vision. And I'm going to talk more about that in the next section up ahead. But just know that your eyes are going to dilate. Okay, they're going to get big. Okay, nice and big, letting in more light, letting in more information. You also get something that's called piloerection. And some of you are giggling at that because you don't know what it means. What piloerection means, when you hear people talk about the hair on the back of my neck standing up, my hair's standing on end. When you see two dogs or two cats squaring off against one another, and you see the hairs on their backs standing up, and it makes them look big. It kind of fluffs everything out. That's what we're talking about, and that's going on all over your body. And the big reason for this is temperature dissipation. Because even though you've clamped down on the periphery, remember I said the blood vessels going to all your major organs are operating full steam ahead, right? They're wide open. So your core temperature is going up because your heart rate's gone up, you're breathing faster, which has a lot to do with kind of how you're changing your pH. Okay, your muscles are in high demand mode, so they're going to be making more byproducts of that metabolism. Everything is leaning that metabolic curve to the side where more temperature is generated. So for that reason, your body wants to be able to push that core temperature away. Obviously, you don't want to overheat in the middle of all this, and that's why you have that piloerection. It also has an added benefit as well of this is a little bit more for lower animals than it is for us, but when their hairs are all standing on end and they take some damage, it has to do with kind of how that damage is dissipated across the surface of their skin. It's a little bit better for them, actually. Another added benefit is it gives you a little bit of hyper awareness on a 360-degree axis of the world around you. And I mean, and we're talking ninja level stuff when I talk about that. But you do have a little bit more of a perception of very small changes in air temperature, very small changes in air movement. This can be very useful in unarmed combat when you're talking about perceiving your opponent's movements, his shifts in his weight, his axis of advance, things of that nature. So when I'm specifically talking about like one-on-one type combat where this would be useful. Getting a little bit deep, so I'm going to back off just a little bit. Another thing that happens with this cascade of hormones is glucose is mobilized in your body. So all your sugar stores that have been held as glycogen, this goes hand in hand with that cortisol boost that we were talking about. So you free up a lot of this stored sugar, a lot of these stored carbohydrates are freed up because, again, cellular metabolism has jumped way up, especially in your organs and these major muscle groups. So you need fuel for that. You not only need oxygen, but you need fuel to burn, so you need those carbohydrates. Well, all this is getting freed up. That plays a big role into that adrenaline dump that a lot of people feel afterwards, because you basically have just burned all your glycogen stores and you feel completely depleted afterwards. And a lot of times you feel really, really hungry, really thirsty, really tired. And it has to do with this huge surge of hormones and going hand in hand with that huge spike in your blood sugar that goes right there along with it. But you need this. Your body needs it. You're going to be burning full steam ahead to either fight through that opponent or to get away from that threat, one or the other. Let's talk about extremes for a minute. So everything I just described is pretty much ideal. We'll consider that kind of the middle of the curve, and from a physiological and evolutionary standpoint. So right there in the middle is pretty much how everybody's going to react, right? So all those things happen. I'm hyper aware, right? My amygdala hit the switch, bypassed my upper reasoning centers. I'm vigilant. I'm ready to go. Heart rate is up. Respiratory rate is up. My digestive tract has stopped because that's not important right now. Periphery has constricted. Central vessels are open. Maximum oxygen, maximum fuel in the form of that glucose going to the muscles, going to the organs. My pupils are wide open and my hairs are standing on end, and I'm ready to fight or I'm ready to run away. That's ideal. Now, we've all felt that surge to the point that it's a little bit unnerving and pretty uncomfortable, right? At the far end of that bell curve, you have complete vapor lock. So people that freeze completely, they just can't handle that surge. Their sympathetic reflex has pushed them so far to the right that they are vapor locked. They are frozen in place, and there's nothing that they can do. There is no fight or flight. There is freeze in place because they've moved into this loop. It's like when you have to reset your computer or reset your Xbox. That's essentially what has happened to them, is they've locked up. From an evolutionary standpoint, that's pretty easy to take care of. That's a person that the saber-toothed tiger would eat, and they would not pass on their genetic material. We don't really have threats like that anymore. We talk a lot about on this podcast about how we've gotten away from basic survival. This is not survival of the fittest anymore. And that's probably a pretty good example. Most people will go their entire lives never knowing if they are the type of person to freeze up or not. And hey, good for them, right? They're going to go their whole life without that challenge. Well, I'm being a little bit sarcastic because I really don't think that's living, and I think most of you don't feel that that's living either. But those people are out there. Those genes have been passed on in some cases, and there have been mutations in other cases where, you think about the fainting goats. I know that I'm probably going to get some social media traffic specifically talking about that, but basically, this is a condition that is not compatible with life in a real survival situation. Just be aware. And some of you listening right now might know from personal experience that your sympathetic nervous system has caused you to freeze up in some type of potentially threatening situation. That doesn't mean that that's the end for you. That doesn't mean that you're resigned to that for the rest of your life. And I'm going to talk some more about that, about some coping mechanisms to deal with that, and some training that you can do to make sure that your sympathetic nervous system is going to operate within those parameters, within those left and right limits, in the middle of the bell curve where we want it. Now let's talk about the left side of the bell curve. So the left side of the bell curve, the right side was people that reacted so strongly they froze up completely. The left side of the bell curve is people that don't have a reaction, that none of that occurs. Their heart rate doesn't go up, their respiratory rate doesn't go up, they don't get mobilization of glucose, they don't get vasoconstriction or vasodilation. They're completely unfazed by it. So who are those people? Some people legitimately just don't have that, okay? Their body just doesn't know how to react. Some people are just completely ignorant of the threat, and I would put the sheep in that category, that they don't know to have that reaction because they have become sheep so much to the extent that they literally just don't even have a reaction to that. They are completely nonplussed, and they will sit there and let the saber-toothed tiger completely devour them without ever even being aware of the threat. There's also a second category of people that don't have that reaction, and that's people that have pushed that reaction to what we call an extinction. These are people that have maybe faced the elephant so many times, seen the elephant, as we say, so many times that they don't have that reaction anymore. I see this in fighters. I see fighters that have fought so many times, when they step in the cage or when they step in the ring, they don't even have a reaction anymore. And that's the time really that you have to step away. Robert O'Neill, the Navy SEAL, who I'm sure you've all heard of, he talked about that in an interview with, why did he get out before retirement? And he said, I found myself going out on targets, going on missions, and I wasn't feeling it. I was too calm. It just wasn't there anymore. And that's dangerous, that when you have desensitized yourself so much to the point that your primitive brain won't even react in potential life or death situations, that's a realization right there. And good for Rob that he had the sense to know that was time to step away, because I can tell you, I've seen operators who didn't have that sense, and they put themselves in danger and they put others in danger as well. Very dangerous. So again, ideally, you want to be right there in the middle. And if you're not, that's something that we're going to talk about. That's something that we can work on. So what does all this mean? Doc, what does all this mean? You've thrown a lot of, you told me about the lizard brain. You told me about some hormones. You told me about some physiological effects. You broke it down for me in these three categories of where people generally tend to fall. So what does this all mean? What does this mean to me? Because that's what I really want to know. That's what a lot of you are thinking. Well, here's what this means. The fight or flight response is a huge metabolic demand, first of all, and that's important. So this is something very taxing to the body. This is a cardiac stress test, if you know what that is, okay? You are putting yourself through the ringer. Your own body is putting you through a cardiac stress test, and you haven't even taken a step in any direction yet. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good, especially to the uninitiated. I remember the first time I ever got a true adrenaline surge, scared to death as a kid. And I remember how incredibly uncomfortable it was when I looked at it after the fact. I'm like, wow, that felt like my body was being torn apart from the inside out. It can also mean difficulty concentrating, because remember, there's a lot of stuff going on here. So your lizard brain is trying to take those shortcuts and tell your body what to do, and your higher brain is still trying to process that information. Remember, just a minute ago, I talked about what it was like for me as a kid. I was in my early teens, I think, at that point, the incident that I'm thinking of, and my prefrontal cortex wasn't even fully developed. So I couldn't adequately process the information. So, and I'm sure that in retrospect, knowing what I know now, that all added into that. That made it a lot more difficult to cope with, a lot more uncomfortable. So what can we do? What can we do knowing that we're going to face this huge metabolic demand, this cardiac stress test, potentially uncomfortable situation that can make it very difficult to concentrate on these higher tasks, and obviously when we're talking about fight or flight, if we're talking about flight, it might just be a matter of picking a direction and running. So that doesn't necessarily take a whole lot of concentration. And that's why people that don't have the proper training and don't really understand it, oftentimes that's the avenue that they're going to take, because their brain says, well, I can't concentrate on anything else. I don't know what, I don't know martial arts. I don't know how to operate this weapon or this gizmo. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to run away. That's the choice that their body makes for them. And they might be already running away before they even realize that they're running away. That they've talked about this for generations in warfare, that, you don't know what you're going to do when that first shot is fired. Are you going to run towards the sound of gunfire? Are you going to run away from the sound of gunfire? Are you going to be one of those people like I talk about who freeze when that happens? And I've seen it in training. You don't know what somebody's going to do in the door or on the ramp of that aircraft in the middle of the night until they actually do it. And it's something. It's a place where you learn about yourself. I'm going to talk about that some more as well. Well, knowing these things, knowing what a huge metabolic demand that this is going to be, you need to prepare for that now. You need to be in good shape. This, more than any other reason, is the reason to be physically fit. This is the reason to exercise. This is the reason to eat properly and to drink plenty of water. Because if 20 minutes from now is the moment that your sympathetic nervous system kicks in and you have that fight or flight, that's the fuel that is fueling your body in that survival situation. Okay? If you ate Krispy Kremes and drank Coke and then went out and had that, it's going to feel entirely different to your body trying to process that fuel, as opposed if you ate some good lean chicken and drank some water. And I'm not knocking Krispy Kreme and Coke. I'll tell you this because Tim's not here. I'm a big junk food lover myself, probably more than I should be at 51 years of age and trying to keep up with guys like him. But hey, it's my weakness. I'm working on it. Not a good example as a doctor, so don't take that as medical advice. But what I'm saying is, be healthy. Okay, this is the reason to be healthy. Don't wait until the moment of the fight or flight response to put your body through that cardiac stress test. You need to be stressing yourself before that and making sure that your body can handle it. The other thing that you need to do is you need to train harder. And I'm not just talking about your physical training. I'm talking about your martial arts training. I'm talking about your weapons training, your armed and unarmed combat skills. You need to train those harder and train them properly, because you need to build those good habits now when you are rested and when you're not fighting against your own sympathetic nervous system. You need to build that muscle memory. We say this time and time and time again. When the chips are down, in times of high stress, you are going to resort. Remember, it's the primitive brain that's taken over. Your primitive brain is calling the shots. So you have to have those patterns of muscle memory established. You have to have trained properly up to that point, because the cognitive centers of your brain are largely bypassed, especially during those first few seconds. So you have to train properly and train harder Train, train, train. I can't emphasize this enough. So that when the chips are down, when you're in that high stress environment, you're going to do what's right because your body knows what to do without the prefrontal cortex, without thinking about the other stuff. It's just going to do it. You have to build these pathways. These neurochemical pathways need to get established in your training so that when you need it, it's there. You don't even have to think about it. You just go. I can't emphasize that enough. Something that you can do to get the edge on that is something that we also call stress inoculation. So not only do you need to go out there and train properly every time, no shortcuts, doing it right, doing it again and again and again until it is muscle memory, but once you have it down, then you need to go back and perform what we call stress inoculation. Then you add stress. So how can we do that? You do that by deliberately making your training uncomfortable. Get out of your bubble, as Gunny Hathcock would say. So you do the training, you do it properly, you get it down. Now you move out of the bubble. So if you normally shoot on a range that has nice overhead cover and shade, temperature regulated, maybe it's an indoor range, whatever it might be. Typically you get up on a day, you decide you're going to go to the range, you have a nice breakfast, you have a cup of coffee, you drive there, plenty to eat, plenty to drink, you take breaks when you need to. You do everything to make yourself comfortable while you're shooting, and you walk away feeling pretty good. Well, that's great. That's great while you're training that muscle memory. But once it's there, now you have to induce that added stress. Okay? Now you need to bring the environment into play. So you need to maybe do things to pre-exhaust yourself, whether that's doing burpees right before you do a shooting iteration, doing sandbag get-ups, just sprinting up the line to do it. If you've ever done any type of 3-gun or 2-gun competition, you know a little bit of what I'm talking about. There are some events where you're running from station to station. However, most of the type of events that I'm talking about, it's very brief. And even those guys that you see with the big giant gut can typically do it. So that's not a lot of stress. Okay, I've been involved in shooting competitions that are true stress events that involve a great deal of stress and thinking under stress. When Alex Acosta was on, we talked about this. So doing something that's physically exertional, and then also doing things that are tying up different portions of your brain as you're doing it. There are targets out there that are pre-made that have numbers, colors, and shapes. You can have a friend who's coaching you, whoever's running that shooting timer, might be calling out numbers, might be calling out shapes, might be calling out colors, might be calling them out in combination. Okay? All things to confuse you, to tie up different parts of your brain so that you will tie up the cognitive parts of your brain doing the cognitive portion of the exercise, and your muscle memory will take care of the actual execution of the shooting. This same type of stress inoculation is equally important whenever you're doing any type of martial arts or any type of training for unarmed combat. That's why sitting in an air-conditioned gym and doing what we call a kata, or doing what we call one-step moves, is not going to train you for a fight. Realistic sparring, getting your heart rate elevated, having the actual stress of an opponent going against you is what is going to truly test your mettle to see if you've actually learned those techniques. Stress inoculation is something we've done in special operations forces for decades, and it's the real reason I think we were so successful in the global war on terror as a special operations force, because we truly believe you train like you fight. More sweat in training means less blood in combat. Getting out there, being stressed, physically exerting yourself. That's why you'll see Ranger battalions do forced road marches for extended period of time and go right into a live fire range. Jumping out of an aircraft, getting your heart rate up, landing on the ground, running to an assembly point, assembling together, moving forward, doing a movement to contact drill. These are all things that induce that stress as training. You notice I'm talking specifically about military type training right now, and when I think of the military training that I went through, that Tim went through, I think of realistic training. That's something in the military where you have a budget, where you have proper risk assessment performed and a lot of support, it's a little bit easier to do. I recognize it's a little bit harder for you if you're going out to the range, to practice these real world scenarios. But get together with your friends or enter some of these realistic shooting competitions that are out there. Make your training as realistic as possible. Make it scenario based, so you go into it not just shooting on a flat range at a paper target, but with some type of shoot, move, communicate scenario. Something where you're going to have to move and execute under pressure. And get into it. I can't emphasize that enough. People that are successful in things like that are the ones who really assume the role, who really in their mind make it real. When I think back to the 1980s, between conflicts and all the exercises that I did in the Ranger Battalion, the key for staying interested and for getting the most out of the training at all times was really getting into the scenario, was really immersing yourself in it and making your mind on some level think, this is real, this is the real deal. You did it when you were a kid. Think about, playing cops and robbers or whatever you did when you were a kid. You got into the role, whether it was Transformers or Star Wars or whatever it was. You fully immersed yourself in that. Do that in your training. And it's not only going to make it better and more realistic and with a better outcome, you're going to enjoy it more. Just because you've made it realistic, you've immersed yourself in that role. Let go. Do it within the bounds of safety, but set up a realistic scenario and execute it. You really have to be uncomfortable. You have to push the envelope physically. You have to go out and shoot when it's raining. Go out and shoot when it's hot. Go out and shoot when it's windy. All of those things. Poor visibility. Force yourself out of that comfort envelope, out of that bubble I was talking about. Train when you're uncomfortable, in full kit, in body armor, exactly as you're going to do it for real. Feel what it really feels like. It's important to wear eye and ear protection. I recognize that, but I've seen some shooting schools that do individual exercises where they will occasionally go without hearing protection, just temporarily, just so you get that idea of what that first shot is going to sound like. It can be quite shocking if you've never gone through it before, and I don't recommend doing that all the time. Hearing conservation is very important. Tim and I have never talked about it. I don't know how he feels about that. I think there's something to be said for it in very small doses, just to inoculate yourself to that and get an idea what it's going to be like. Don't do it all the time. You want to conserve your hearing. You don't want to have hearing aids in your 50s. And I'm not saying that, but experience it at least once just to see what it's like. I remember the first time I did a live fire with no hearing protection in as a young Ranger, and how shocked I was at what everything sounds like around you with no hearing protection in. And finally, when it comes to stress inoculation, face your fears. Do things that scare you. Now, this doesn't have to be directly in conjunction with your training, but do things that scare you just because they scare you. Do you have a fear of heights? Take a mountaineering course. Do you have a fear of the water? Take a scuba diving course or go to a swimming class. Have somebody who knows how to swim really well get in the water with you. Whatever these fears are, you need to face them. Because the more you have faced your fears and you have felt that sympathetic release, okay, that rush of adrenaline, you're going to know how to cope with it better. Even if you've faced fears in a completely different scenario than life or death. It might not be a fist fight or a firefight, but you have faced things that scare you before, and it's familiar to you, whatever that might be. For me, that was standing on the ramp of a C-130 aircraft at 3 o'clock in the morning at 18,000 feet with an oxygen mask on, with a parachute on my back, and with a rucksack hanging down below my waist, waddling to the end of that ramp, sticking my toes on it, looking off into the abyss, and waiting for that light to go green and that jump master to stand up and give the signal that entire halo pass, all of us were going to dump out just like an entire box of cornflakes into the night, and then screaming to earth at 120 miles an hour. And the only thing I'm really able to see is the occasional chem light on another jumper zipping by and my own altimeter. And I don't even know what my heart rate was at that point, but I know my pupils were dilated. I was taking in all the information in the back of that C-130. My mouth was dry as a bone. I could hear my own breathing inside that oxygen mask. I was breathing way too fast. This is before I really learned to control my breathing in a manner that I'm going to discuss with you. But for me, that was a big way to face my fears. I mean, that's basically everything all rolled into one. The only other experience I think I've ever had that was quite as bad from a fear perspective is doing what we call the dunker, which is a big simulated helicopter fuselage that they dump upside down into a pool while you're blindfolded with a flight helmet and a flight suit on, and you're completely strapped in, and you have to unbuckle yourself and swim, right yourself, and then swim to a window and then get out. The whole time you're blind. You're getting no minimal sensory input. You're upside down. You're surrounded by water. You can't breathe. I used to tell people the only thing that could have made that any more scary was if they would have released snakes into the water, because literally every primal fear you have, being underwater, not being able to breathe, being blindfolded so you can't see, feeling other people around you, getting kicked in the face by other people who are going through the exact same thing as you, trying to swim out, and all along you're thinking, am I going to have enough oxygen to make it? Is this literally going to kill me? Even though it's a controlled training environment. And if you're wondering what the dunker looks like, you can actually look at the YouTube videos. It's an interesting experience. I'm glad I went through it. I'm glad I faced those fears. Not something I'd want to do every day, I'll be perfectly honest with you. So right about now you're asking yourself, how do I become a master of my own fears? How do I control that? What do I do, Doc, in that situation to maximize my own participation in my sympathetic nervous system so that I'm not completely debilitated when the time comes? Well, that's what I want to talk about next. So the two big things, I talked about a lot of effects of this, but the two big things that always stick out to me, and two things you can do something about, are your breathing and your eyesight. You remember I talked about your breathing is going to become rapid and somewhat shallow, which is your body's initial reaction, and it's a normal reaction, okay? But it's not ideal, and that's something that you can control. So the important thing about controlling your breathing is, as you control your breathing and you control the rate at which oxygen comes in and CO2 is pushed out, and you also are controlling how much pressure is in your chest cavity, you are also slowing down your heart rate. You'll notice that trained fighters in MMA, and I know Tim does this, they work very hard on controlling their breathing in between rounds, because that brings their heart rate down, that brings their metabolic demand down, and then they enter the next round better able to cope. Okay, they might have been smoked at the end of round one, but they go into round two renewed, more oxygen on board, they've slowed their heart rate down, and they're ready to go again. They're not completely debilitated because they've done these breathing exercises that are very similar to the ones I'm about to talk about to bring that heart rate down. So there's a couple of different terms for this. Some people call it tactical breathing. Been a couple of books out there that call it that. There's some YouTube videos you can watch that refer to it specifically as tactical breathing. Mark Devine calls it breathing in a box breathing. Okay, and it's a technique that he teaches. This has been around forever. This is not something the special operations community or the military invented. This goes back millennia. Okay, some say this is directly connected with yoga. I don't know, it may be. But the principle is very sound from a medical standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, and from a tactical standpoint. We know it works. So this is what you do. So whatever it is that you're doing, exercise-wise, and it's a good idea to practice this with exercise. Because remember I said you need to simulate that stress, right? So I do this technique when I'm doing jiu-jitsu. So when we have that 1 minute break in between 5 or 6 minute rounds, I'm doing my tactical breathing, my box breathing, to bring my heart rate down, to maximize my oxygenation before I start that next roll. I do the same thing when I'm shooting on the range. If we're doing some type of exercise where maybe I'm sprinting obstacles or doing burpees or doing get-ups or whatever it might be, I take a brief time period to do a couple of repetitions of box breathing, okay? As tempted as you are to just draw and shoot right out of the bat, and yeah, sometimes you got to do that. Sometimes it's a better idea to calm your breath, to bring your heart rate under control, to focus, and make sure that first round is going to hit right on target. And it may only require one repetition of this. Again, not always possible. Sometimes you arrive at the cutting edge of battle and boom, you got to shoot right there on the spot. You can still do your tactical breathing through this. If you're conscious of it, if you practice it like anything, you're going to start doing it without thinking about it. So what is it? So I want you to think in your mind of a square, of a box. Okay, it's drawn in the air in front of you. It has 4 sides. You're starting in the lower left-hand corner of that box as we move. Each side of that box is made up of 4 seconds. 4 seconds of an inhale on the way up that first line, that first side. A 4-second pause going across the top. A 4-second exhale going down the right side. And then a 4-second pause going across the bottom. In through your nose, out through your mouth. I think it's a better idea to exhale through pursed lips. Some people don't do it that way. I do because I feel I get a little bit more controlled respiration. A little bit of what we call auto peeping in medicine. Keep a little bit more intrathoracic pressure, a little bit more pressure on the vagus nerve, a little bit easier to bring the heart rate down. Okay? Practice this technique. Okay? I'm gonna do one repetition for you here. Okay? You can count the 4 seconds in your head. You can put it on a stopwatch in front of you. However you want to do it. It doesn't really matter. You can count your fingers while you do it. There's multiple different ways to do it. After a while, once you do it, you're going to find a happy medium that might be 3 seconds, it might be 5 seconds, but you're going to find what's right for you. The important thing is all the sides. Remember, it's a box, it's a square, so all the sides need to be the same. Not inhale, pause, exhale. Okay? They all need to be the same. So I'm going to practice one for you right now, starting at the bottom. 4 seconds each side. And inhale. So just like that, 4 seconds each side, in through the nose, pause, out through pursed lips, pause. These are your natural respiratory pauses, okay? You can pause on the inhale, you can pause on the exhale. A lot of you who did basic marksmanship in the military, we get trained to exhale completely and squeeze the trigger on that respiratory pause, that natural respiratory pause. There used to be this ridiculous notion that you take a full breath in, you exhale half of it and hold your breath. And half is never the same, so that's a ridiculous way to do it. In my opinion, a full exhalation and going on the pause after an expiration, for me, is always how I do it because I trained that way for decades. But you can shoot on either one of those pauses, okay? And the important thing is to use those pauses properly. Practice it with a timer, practice it with counting in your head, do it again and again and again. So next time you're doing any type of exercise, whether it's CrossFit, Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, whatever it might be, when you're in that interval in between, do this box breathing, do this tactical breathing. You'll immediately see the advantage of it. It's very calming. It brings your heart rate down. You are bringing your respiratory rate down. You're getting maximum oxygenation and the proper amount of CO2 off-gassing as you do it. Really important. So tactical breathing, also known as box breathing. I know I couldn't really give you a great demonstration with just you listening on the podcast. There are videos out there and I encourage you to watch them. Really useful technique. So that's what we're going to do with our breathing. And in mastering our breathing, we're also mastering that heart rate. And in mastering the heart rate, that rush that we get in our ears is going to be somewhat diminished too. So, hearing tends to tamp down during the sympathetic response. You're going to get a little bit of that back as you slow your heart rate down. You're going to feel more calm, more in focus with the situation. Trust me, it works wonders. So the other thing is eyesight. Remember I talked about you get that huge pupillary dilation. So what does pupillary dilation do? Well, it's like opening up that aperture on a camera lens to maximum. You get maximum depth of field there, right? You get maximum detail. Colors become more vivid. The fine focus on every little detail in that scenario in front of you, because you have increased light coming in because your pupils are completely dilated. But another thing that it does is it decreases your peripheral vision. It becomes focused. Now that's a good thing in that you want to be focused on the danger with complete elimination of anything on the periphery that's going to distract you from that, right? You want to focus on the task at hand. However, I want you to consider this. Your eyes are fully dilated, so you have lost a degree of peripheral vision. How many degrees of that? You can look it up. I didn't do a lot of homework. I didn't want to cheat on this. Something I had to know for a test at one point, and honestly, I don't remember right now. But you do lose some peripheral vision, whatever it is. Let's say it's 10% per side. I don't know, but you lose some. Okay, in a tactical situation, that's both good and bad because you're focusing on the task at hand. But remember, there's threats everywhere. We teach this in the Sheepdog course, right? You clear far, you clear near, and that's all around you. So you don't want to lose awareness of other threats. Now, let's say you lost 10% on each side, right? So I've already lost 20% of my peripheral vision. Now, are you somebody who shoots with one eye closed? Now you've already lost 20%. Now you're losing 50% of that 80% that you had left. So now you're down to a 40% of your vision. Okay, that means you have 60% threat out there that could be perceived that you're not perceiving because you've tunneled yourself in even more. The debate on the 2 eyes open, 1 eye is open for shooting goes back and forth, even among very experienced shooters. I know some will tell you that it's basically like settled science, and I'm making air quotes here. But I can tell you from talking to very experienced senior chief SEAL team operators, very experienced sergeants major, Delta Force operators, and a myriad of SF guys, it's anything but settled. I've had guys tell me time and again, hey, I've been training this way for so long, whatever it is, 1 eye open, both eyes open, that there's no way that I can change. I do it the way that I do it, and it works for me, so I'm not going to change it. But I want you to take this as a takeaway point. Exactly what I said earlier. If you are closing 1 eye, you are now tunneling even more than your sympathetic reflexes already have you doing. And that can, from a tactical standpoint, can be very bad. So if for no other reason, this, in my opinion, is a good reason to train shooting with both eyes open. Okay? As a minimum, let's say you can't retrain yourself. You shoot with optics in such a way or whatever it is. Mike, I absolutely cannot retrain myself at this point. All right? Then train yourself reflexively, that as soon as you are done engaging a target, okay, when you're indexing that target, when you're clearing far and clearing near, your muscle memory is telling you to reopen that other eye. Again, best case scenario, you need to be shooting with both eyes open. Okay? You don't want to hamper yourself more than your own nervous system is already doing. So those are the 2 takeaways. Control your breathing with box breathing and 2 eyes open. Those are 2 things you can train yourself to do right now, starting today, so that when you're in that fight or flight situation, you have some good habits trained to control your breathing, control your heart rate, and maximize your sensory input in the form of vision by not narrowing your scope too much. So we talked about a lot today, and I'm going to give you the takeaway points, and then I'm going to let you go with no homework. Takeaway points: be fit, be healthy. Tim talks about it all the time. He's the prime example of it. He's the person you should be striving to emulate, not me. I'll tell you that right now. Exercise, 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 so your body can take the stress in advance. Give yourself good fuel. Drink plenty of water. Good healthy fuel to burn. 20 minutes from now, that might be the fuel that's saving your life. Think about that. Train properly. Train to do things the right way. Don't take shortcuts, people. Train properly, whether it's martial arts or whether it's shooting or whether it's using a bow staff or nunchucks. I don't care. Train to do it properly and train realistically, okay? Does a flat range look like a back alley or a liquor store or a bar? No, it doesn't. Does your jiu-jitsu academy look like a street fight? No, it doesn't. Okay? Get out of your bubble. Train realistically. Seek out stress inoculation. Okay? Roll against that biggest guy in the class. Ask the black belt at your jiu-jitsu academy if, hey, let's roll 10-minute rounds today. Let's Shark Tank today. Okay, if you don't know what that is, look it up. If you don't know what that is, you're not training. Look it up. All right, let's do some things that are challenging, that are going to inoculate me against stress. Let's do Shark Tank where every single time I have to start with somebody already taking the back with hooks in, again and again and again, and I'm gonna fight against that. Okay, do stuff that's challenging. Get yourself used to that stress. Get out of your comfort zone. Get your heart rate up when you're doing this training, or you're not doing it to the best benefit. Learn your tactical breathing. Practice your tactical breathing. Breathe in a box. 4-second inhale, 4-second pause, 4-second exhale, 4-second pause. Practice it. Keep both eyes open no matter what you're doing. Okay? Keep your eye on the prize. Maximum depth perception at all times. That's the best advice I can give you as far as that goes. Stay in charge of your lizard brain. Don't you let your lizard brain rule you when the time comes that the chips are down. Okay? You need to get a head start on mastering it right now, because the lizard brain has been around unchanged for millennia, for generations. Okay? If you let it, it's going to take over completely. It's going to turn the rest of your brain to jelly, and it's going to completely rule that situation. And that's not a situation you want to be in, where you're having to listen to generations of programming as opposed to doing what you've trained for and doing it right. That's all the best advice that I can give you on this subject. Thank you very much on Twitter for giving the suggestion. Follow me on Twitter at Dr. Mike Simpson. That's at DrMikesimpson. I'm on Instagram under the same title. Tim is on Tim Kennedy MMA, both on Instagram and Twitter. Make sure you check out Sheepdog Response on our Facebook page. Thank you for allowing me into your life this week. Hopefully Tim will be back real soon. I know he's real anxious to get back in here, share his great wealth of knowledge with you guys. So until next time, I'm going to leave you with a quote by Dr. Henry Cloud, who said, "We change our behavior when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing." What's your pain like right now? What's more painful for you? To stay the way you are or to change? Make that decision. Make it today. And until next time, be a sheepdog.
You have been listening to The Sheepdog Project. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Sheepdog Response. The views expressed on this podcast are those of the individual and do not represent any larger entity, public or private.